Hi everyone, thank you for joining me for another week. I just wanted to first share my gratitude for your patience on the release of this episode. This was supposed to come out last week, but I have continued to prepare for my move. If you follow me on Instagram at SimplerTimeCrimePod, I'm moving into a new house that's needed a little bit more prep work than I expected, but I'm also excited to share that my new space is better for recording and soon I'll be there. So the quality of the sound should be better than even what you're hearing right now, and I'm really excited for that. So thank you, and I'm really excited to get back at it. This week's episode is a little bit different. Many of the cases I've featured and will continue to feature are ones where you'll say, what are the odds that that would happen? So the 3 women I featured in the previous episode went missing after a day at a crowded beach on 4th of July weekend. And Margie Dabney was a woman with dementia who wandered off at the DFW airport immediately after 9/11, and not only did she go missing, she was found murdered several years later. Jennifer Lynn had someone hide out in her house after school and murder her after watching her do her routine for hours. David Blockett was abducted as a tiny newborn from someone posing as a social worker, and these are just a few of the cases I've covered. But today, I'm talking about something that every single one of you listening knows someone who has encountered this. Some of you have encountered it yourselves. I'll be discussing a case of someone who disappeared after encountering intimate partner violence in their relationship. While I don't have enough time in one episode to dive into all the nuances of intimate partner violence and its shifts through the years, I do want to discuss some of the ways in which the system worked differently then versus now, and some of the barriers from then versus now. The case I'm featuring today is from 1962, and despite most people having a good idea of what they think happened to her, her body has never been found, and her family has never received any closure or answers. This is A Simpler Time True Crime, The Disappearance of Joan Hansen. Joanne Ellen Cooper was born July 19, 1932. She had 3 sisters and grew up in Auburn, Washington in the Kent Valley. According to the book Don't Look Behind You, written by the late queen of true crime Anne Rule, which, by the way, she covered this case extensively and I encourage you to go read it. But according to that book, the girls attended a strict religious academy which Joanne hated, and they were very sheltered. Joanne was tall, with brown hair, and known to be absolutely glamorous. Right out of school, she married a man named Walter Morrison. During this time in her life, around 1955, she met who would become her inseparable best friend, Patricia Martin. Patricia lived on her street, and she was married to a friend of Walter's at the time. It was around this time that Joanne gave birth to her first son, Bobby. Patricia Martin also had a son, and so the two often got together for coffee and visits. Joanne was in her early 20s and raising a baby while tending to the house. Patricia Martin would later recount to Anne Rule that it was pretty common for families to only have one car back then, so their routine was to get their housework done and then get together and have coffee, smoke cigarettes, and visit while their children played. But in her marriage, Joanne started to get kind of restless. Walter was very introverted and just preferred nights at home, and Joanne was extremely social and extroverted. She liked to go out on dates or go out and socialize, and she was craving this, especially with the changes of becoming a mother and still just being so young. So the two started to feel some friction. Patricia and Joanne became pregnant again at the same time in the later half of the 1950s. Joanne had a much more difficult pregnancy this time, but this time around, both gave birth to baby girls, and Joanne named her daughter Holly Lou. Unfortunately, when the baby was just a month old, she died of sudden infant death syndrome. Patricia and Joanne became even closer friends during this time, as Pat Martin really stepped up to comfort her and help her through her grief. in sharing secrets through their coffee dates, Joan admitted one day to Pat Martin that she had an affair with a local physician in town. She had this push and pull of wanting to be a good mother and a good wife, and was also being pulled in the direction of experiencing things she had been sheltered from and living out her early 20s differently. With everything seeming to spiral after Holly Lou's sudden death, Joan suffered a nervous breakdown. She stated that when she looked in the mirror, she saw the face of the devil looking back at her. Walter took her to a mental health facility in Seattle where they gave her shock therapy and sodium pentothal, or what's also known as truth serum. While under the effects of this, Walter asked her if she had an affair with other men, and she admitted to the affair with the doctor. Right then and there, Walter ended their marriage and filed for divorce based on her infidelity. During this time period, the word divorce might as well have been a swear word. Women were judged harshly for being divorced, particularly single mothers, and the opportunities for them were slim. The social norm was for women to be stay-at-home moms or homemakers, while the husband worked and provided for the family. While this setup worked for some and continues to work for some today, on a macro level, it really creates a power dynamic that's more conducive to abusive homes, and it makes it difficult for people to leave. So to be clear, in this instance, she definitely was not in an abusive relationship with Walter, but I do want to discuss this now just because it kind of paves the way for what's to come for her. Women who did want to leave abusive relationships would have to figure out how to financially support themselves, which was difficult to do when they weren't earning income to begin with, especially, if they were homemakers. For people who did successfully get a divorce, the struggle of a one-income household where they were already making less than their male peers would also make finding a new partner more appealing, because if you're struggling as a single parent, of course it's going to be appealing to remove some of that burden and feel like you can get on your own 2 feet. So it just sets up a scene where you're more likely to excuse red flags or enter into an abusive relationship because you're desperate to feel stable, particularly if you're a parent and you're trying to provide for your child. I want to take a moment to do a shout out to a new podcast I've been following. It's called The Lesbian Detectives, and they're on YouTube, Spotify, TikTok, just about any listening platform you can think of. They deep dive into cases that have largely been forgotten or that you haven't heard about. They recently covered the case of Jaleel Rainwater, and they covered the complexities of this case with such care and respect, which is so important in this true crime podcasting space. They were giving their own personal experiences with the foster care and adoption system, and they did it thoughtfully and tastefully and really added to the conversation. I highly recommend that episode and for you to give them a follow and listen to any of their episodes. I also enjoy that they share their own theories and thoughts on the case, and it makes you kind of feel like you're in the room talking with them. So head on over and give them a watch or listen. Now, back to the show. Joan quickly re-entered the dating scene, and she was trying to settle down, but she really couldn't find anybody. She had a tendency to date more high-profile men, wealthier men, and I know that may seem shallow, and I can understand that, but she was trying to just find financial stability for herself and her child. But these flings didn't last, and some of the men would later tell her they were married, which just reminds me that really the dating scene probably wasn't all that different then versus now. It's just now we have to deal with Tinder. But it wasn't long before Joan would find the next man that she would marry. In 1957, Joan married Robert, who went by Bob Milton Hansen. Just as a note, if you Google Robert Hansen, you will find tons of articles on a notorious Alaskan serial killer known as the Butcher Baker. That man was a successful baker and businessman by day, but by night, he kidnapped and murdered over a dozen women in Alaska. He would abduct them and then release them into the wilderness and hunt them down again like prey. So just think of the Hunger Games, or going back even further and more accurately, The Most Dangerous Game. This is different, so I'll just refer to him as Bob Hansen as I retell Joanne's story. Joanne and her son Bobby from her previous marriage moved in with Bob, and they quickly grew their family, having 3 children, 2 boys and a girl, in the first 3 years of marriage. Each February she got pregnant, and each November, like clockwork, she gave birth in 1957, 1958, and 1959. Their names were Nick, Candy K, and Ty. Bob was charismatic and very successful. In fact, over the years, he amassed so much wealth that his estate was worth several $1,000,000 at the time of his death. He was strong and good-looking and had a protective way about him. When Bob and Joan first got together, he was making his living as a carpenter and a fisherman. And when I say fisherman, I want you to picture the TV show The Deadliest Catch. He was doing hardcore stuff. He was going out on fishing vessels off the coast of Alaska, sometimes gone for weeks or months at a time in very dangerous situations, but the money was incredibly good. After Bob's initial charm, his disposition changed. He became incredibly violent and controlling even when Joanne was pregnant. He controlled who she was allowed to speak to. He wouldn't allow her to speak to her own family or announce her pregnancies and the births of her children. Some of her family didn't even know she had more children after Bobby. The one person she did maintain contact with was her long-term best friend, Patricia Martin. Bob's abuse did not stop at Joanne. When Joanne's oldest son was 6 years old, he went to the grocery store with Bob and Joanne and asked Bob to buy a soda. Bob asked the boy to read the brand name, but he couldn't read yet. He kept asking him to say it, and the boy just couldn't. When they returned home, he took the boy to the basement and beat him so severely he couldn't walk for 2 months. Immediately following this incident, Joanne was able to get access to the car and bring him to Patricia Martin's, begging her for help. During this time, Joanne sent her injured son to live with Patricia, who cared for him. When Joanne's ex-husband became aware of this, he petitioned for and was granted custody of the young boy. Pat said she loved her time with Bobby and she wanted to keep him and do anything she could do to keep him away from Bob. In the end, she was sad to have him go back with his biological father, but it made the most sense and it kept him safe. Joanne was grief-stricken over this, but she didn't know what else to do. She was pregnant again when this situation happened, so this happened in the midst of her 3 pregnancies with Bob because she had 3 total. And she felt stuck at this point. She knew he was violent, but she didn't know a way out. The abuse and violence towards Joanne escalated. Bob would hit Joanne where her bruises wouldn't be visible, such as her breasts and her abdomen. During the birth of one of her children, her obstetrician was so horrified that her breasts were so bruised they were black. He took photographs to document this, but it didn't seem much came of it after that. Nowadays, at all my doctor's appointments, and especially when I was pregnant for my children, I'm asked if I'm safe in my home, and the doctor's offices have become a safe haven for victims of intimate partner violence to seek help. But back then, there just simply weren't the resources. In fact, the first full-fledged domestic violence shelter wasn't actually opened until 1974, and they called it a battered women's shelter back then. Joanne lived through life walking on eggshells. She never knew what would set Bob off. One night, Patricia Martin and their spouses were invited to go out on a social gathering where they were going to get very dressed up and go to a dance. Pat and Joanne had gone shopping earlier in the week, and Joanne had spotted some beautiful feathered earrings. She was planning to wear a red sequined dress, and these feathered earrings that were very popular at the time would go perfect with it. She told Pat that she wasn't allowed to spend money without Bob's permission. Pat said, well, just buy them, and if he noticed, she could say that Pat got them for her. On the night of the dance, the couples were all dolled up and they were getting ready to leave the Hansen residence. Suddenly, Bob noticed Joanne's earrings. He asked where she got them, and she stuck to the script. But she hadn't disposed of the receipt, and so he caught her in a lie. He took her into their bedroom and closed the door. Pat Martin and her husband could hear him beating her severely, just from the other room. After a while, Bob reemerged from the bedroom and said that Joanne was no longer up to attending the event tonight, and he said it with a smirk on his face. When Patricia saw her the next day, her whole face was black and blue. In interviews by Ann Rule and others, Pat Martin expressed incredible regret in not figuring out a way to intervene or get Joanne help, but she and her husband were also afraid of Bob Hansen. Pat's husband was even a police officer, but it was just uncommon to interfere in what was considered personal business behind closed doors back then, and I just can't emphasize how prevalent that was enough. In fact, in the early 60s, domestic violence cases that were actually even taken seriously were seen in the civil court versus the criminal court. So if by chance the husband was found to be guilty, he would face civil sentencing and penalties, which were significantly less than if he were to assault a stranger. This is also not a time of no-fault divorce, and it wasn't until into the 60s that even some states entertained divorce due to grounds of cruel and unusual punishment. And even states that had this, you had to prove that you had been hit a significant amount of times and suffered a sufficient amount of beatings, which was left up to interpretation. Women who were granted these divorces because of these beatings were often denied welfare and government benefits to get back on their feet because their husbands' salaries were still factored in, even though they were divorced. These practices gave birth to the women's liberation movement, where women banded together and said, listen, what happens in the home behind closed doors is deeply political. And they identified the three biggest contributing factors to crimes against women were economic disparity, traditional gender role expectations, and a criminal justice system that did not hold men accountable. Joanne was on the cusp of this, but still deeply embedded in a society that was out to protect Bob and not her. One night, they were out dancing with friends, and he got angry and beat her in front of people. Nobody intervened, and nobody called the police. One night, she made trout that he had caught. Bob was obviously still a big fisherman, and she had been eating the trout, and she had peeled the skin off and set it to the side of her plate, and Bob wanted her to eat the skin. He kept yelling at her to eat it, and she kept saying, I can't, and he told her, eat it, and she said, I can't, it will make me sick. And so he swung and hit her so hard he knocked her off the bench she was sitting on. She ran into the kitchen as her children sat at the table stunned and fearful. Bob also walked away and returned a short time later with a Derringer pistol in his hand. He showed it to his children and said, see this? This is what we are going to use to kill Mommy. Joanne knew he meant it. She told Patricia Martin that she was afraid for her life and that she was certain Bob would try to kill her. That next morning after the incident at the dinner table, Joanne watched as Bob drove away to a construction site. It was July 25th, 1962. She gathered up her children and fled to Pat Martin's house. Pat and her husband hid Joanne's vehicle so that he couldn't find her. She bravely went and filed for an order of protection. It wasn't granted right away, but she got the ball rolling. I did some research and found that protection orders and restraining orders didn't officially exist until into the 70s, so I don't know exactly how hers was filed or what it was classified as, but she did feel that having this protection order would keep her safe, as it forbid Bob to contact her or come near her should it be granted. I did some research on modern-day domestic violence restraining orders, and according to fighterlaw.com, a DVRO encompasses the following. The person may not go near you or contact you, your children, family, or others who live with you. They may not go near your home, place of work, or children's schools. They may not move out of the house you share together. They may not own or possess a firearm. They may not follow child custody or visitation orders. They must pay child, spousal, or partner support. They have to keep away from your pets, and they have to continue paying specific bills. They're not supposed to acquire any large expenses or do something significant like rack up credit card debt or affect your property if you're married or domestic partners. They're not to make alterations to insurance policies, and they must return or release special property. And this is not an exhaustive list, nor do all of these things apply to everybody who is served with a domestic violence restraining order. But that is just some preliminary information on them. But the website does go on to say what we all know too well. The filing is important in the way of legal protection, but it's not a huge tool for personal protection. In fact, you never know how your abuser may respond. They go on to say that this could be the antecedent to assault or physical violence, taking away or harming children, damaging shared property, ignoring the order and making continued threats or asking someone else to, harming or killing pets, harassing your loved ones for information, stalking, filing a retaliatory restraining order against you, and lying about you in court documents, online, or other public spaces. It goes on to say to just be prepared that if you file this, there's likely going to be more violence and the leaving is going to get tougher. So again, I hope this paints the picture of the challenges women faced back then and the barriers still faced today. It's just not as simple as just leave. In fact, according to Battered Women's Support Services, or BWSS, the most dangerous time for women who are in a domestic violence situation is leaving. 77% of domestic violence-related homicides occur after leaving, and there is a 75% increase for violence after separation for the 2 years that follow. So Joanne had a tough road ahead of her, but she was determined. She found an attorney who was all too familiar with Bob Hansen. His name was Duncan Bonjourni, and he had a long history in the public service sphere, and he was previously a judge who had sentenced Bob Hansen in a violent road rage incident to 1 overnight in jail, the only jail time Bob would ever serve in his disgusting, violent life. Diane told Duncan Bonjourni that she wanted to file for divorce. Again, at this time, no-fault divorce wasn't a thing, so she had to prove why she needed one, and so she showed the attorney her bruises. He was immediately convinced. Duncan Bonjourni would tell Ann Rule for her book that she was covered in bruises in all parts that were covered by clothing. Some on her side were as big as saucers. He agreed immediately that she was in danger and needed to file for divorce. He stated he could tell Joanne was deeply fearful of her husband, but was working hard to move forward. He told Joanne he would represent her in the divorce proceedings and they could just discuss money later. In the weeks to come, Joanne and Bob began their very difficult divorce proceedings. Bob had over $300,000 in assets at that point, and Joanne and Bob were arguing over the division of them. Primarily, Joanne was just focused on having a house for herself and her children, and some spousal support or child support to stay on her feet. On August 8th, Joanne was granted her restraining order against Bob. Part of this restraining order specified that Bob was to move out of the family home and Joanne was to move back in. She was terrified to move back in, but Joanne was looking forward to the divorce finalizing, having her home back, and just moving on with her life. As she left Pat Martin's house on August 10th, Pat recalled she had just $5 to her name. In fact, she didn't even have enough money for a box of hair dye she was hoping for, so Pat lent her a little money for that. Joanne asked Pat if she would mind staying with her for a couple nights just until she could get the locks changed. In Pat's interview with Ann Rule, Ann said you could tell Pat still had so much regret about this, but she was scared too. She knew that Bob held a grudge against her for helping Joanne get out, and she was scared of what he might do. So she told her that she wasn't comfortable, but she did want Joanne to call her when she got back home, just so they could check in and make sure everything was okay and that Bob wasn't there. So she did. And she began a casual conversation with Pat because on that day, August 10th, 1962, Joanne was supposed to meet her sisters and mother at the World's Fair in Kings County, Washington. At first, Joanne told Pat that everything was good and safe. She was beginning to feel at ease and said it was probably a good move for her to come home. Both women were relieved. But just minutes later, while still on the phone, Patricia said Joan's demeanor suddenly changed. Pat said she heard Joanne say, "Wait, Pat, oh my God, he's here, he's in the basement, he's coming." And then she heard Joanne scream, and the call ended. Pat was frantic and panic-stricken. She repeatedly called the house back. The phone rang and rang with no answer. So she hung up and tried back again, and it rang and rang with no answer. So she hung up and tried again, and it rang and rang with no answer. She did this for a half an hour straight. Finally, 30 minutes in, she heard a familiar voice on the other end of the line that made her blood run cold. It was Bob. She asked, "I want to talk to Joanne. Where is Joanne?" And he calmly just said, "She's with you." Pat wanted to call the police immediately, but her husband discouraged her, explaining that adults had to be missing for 48 hours before they could report her missing. The next day, Pat sort of paced back and forth. For an instant, she sort of gave way to the idea that maybe she was able to get away and stay at a hotel somewhere, but she just let that go pretty quick because she knew that if Joanne had gotten to safety, she would never let Pat just hang on and worry. She would have found a way to contact her and let her know that she's okay. To make matters worse, Joanne never showed up to meet her sisters and her mother at the fair. They waited and waited at the meeting spot, even considering that they got the time wrong at some point, but she just never showed up. Duncan Bongiorni was immediately concerned, and he intervened. He requested the sheriff's department issue an all-points bulletin if Joanne didn't show up in 24 hours. But as it turns out during this time, the APB is about the extent of searches people did for a missing adult. Basically sort of flagged their system for if somebody showed up, but otherwise there was no investigation into their whereabouts. Missing persons cases just weren't investigated back then in the same way as if they had a homicide on their hands, and they weren't investigated in the way that they are today. On August 15th, Bob Hansen finally got around to filing a missing persons report on Joanne Hansen. I can imagine it finally occurred to him that it didn't look too great for a spouse to just never report their spouse missing. But the message he had to his children was that their mother had abandoned them. Her 3 children with Bob Hansen were all under 5 years old at the time, and baby Ty didn't even have any memories of his mother. Weeks after Joanne's disappearance, her Chevy was found in a Seattle neighborhood trashed with cigarettes and garbage. Joanne kept her car meticulous. The belief is that whoever abandoned the car left the keys in it, and somebody just took it an opportunity for either being a car thief or a joyrider. I often wonder what could be found if you could track the ownership of that car. I wonder with today's evidence possibilities what you might find, but that's neither here nor there at this point. Duncan Bongiorni continued the divorce action in her absence. On November 21st, the divorce was granted. Robert said he didn't abuse Joan, and he actually accused her of stealing $8,000 from him and sought to keep all property, all assets. But the judge said, no way, there is sufficient evidence to indicate Joanne had been abused, and you're not getting all of that. So Joanne was given 40% of the marital property, and Robert was granted 60%. The court ordered that if she did not return alive, her share would be held in a trust for her children until they turned 18. But Bob being Bob, found a way around this, and despite this, when her children turned 18, they got nothing, and all of Joanne's portion came under Bob's control. Joanne was legally declared dead in 1975 after it was found that her Social Security was never used after her disappearance. Bob was abusive to his children, though there were times that they would recite fond memories, vacations he would take them on, and moments of softness. Candy Kay, the middle daughter, tragically died from substance abuse disorder as an adult. Joanne's absence from their life had impact on all the children. Ty Hansen, Bob's youngest son, who faced the most abuse over the years, said that he and his dad never saw eye to eye. But Ty had always believed that his mom abandoned him, until the 1990s when he found the divorce papers that stated she was a battered woman. Ty began asking questions and poking around, and this really initiated his quest to find out what his father did to his mother. In talking with people from the town and family and friends, he learned that just about everybody believed Bob Hansen had murdered Joanne, and that they just couldn't prove it to hold him accountable. In fact, he later recounted to Ann Rule how disheartening it was to have his mom reduced to the woman who was possibly buried in cement in town. His beautiful mother was known as just a woman who was a victim of domestic violence and whom everyone seemed to have forgotten, and that nobody was looking for, and he wanted to change that. Bob had led a conflicted life after Joanne disappeared. He hired a series of housekeepers whom he wanted to be housekeepers with benefits. In fact, I'm not even making this up. He wanted to keep that up well into his 70s and 80s until the time of his death. He had made a small fortune in the construction and real estate investment business and spent a large amount of time in Costa Rica. He hoped to live out his old age there, and he had even purchased a condo in the early 2000s. He used his money and power to date women from Costa Rica, two of whom he married, by financially providing for them when they lived in immense poverty. So in one instance, he had helped a woman's family, and then he required she marry him in return. They had no running water and no suitable shelter, and because of his carpentry skills, he actually built them a nice house, and they just felt forever indebted to him, and he basically said, well, you can have your daughter marry me. So she did, and she was nearly 50 years his junior, and he somehow got her back into the United States. There's no actual proof on how that really went down and how he got her across the border, but he did. And neighbors would recall how they weren't allowed to speak to her, how one time when Bob was out for the day, they invited her to attend some sort of festival with them, and she went, and when Bob got home, he looked at the neighbors and said, I own her. You cannot take her anywhere without my permission. She's not allowed to do these things. Now, that marriage did end up in divorce, and investigators were able to prove that she made it back to Costa Rica safely. So I'm so sorry for everything that woman experienced at the hands of Bob Hansen, including what any woman experienced at the hands of Bob Hansen, but I'm so happy to hear that she made it out alive. At one point when Bob was in Costa Rica, witnesses saw him enter a hiking trail with a young woman he had been dating and come out without her. When asked where she was, he said she had just wandered off on her own, but he was carrying her backpack. Bob's name was jotted down, but he was never arrested or charged in any connection with her disappearance. At one point, in looking for a housekeeper, he held a woman hostage on his property for days. When she escaped, authorities began looking into him as the Green River Killer. Bob lived right on the river and walked several miles along the river each day collecting trash. Of course, we now know this killer to be Gary Ridgway, but for a while he was certainly on their radar. Bob disinherited his surviving children in his old age. In the early 2000s, it was clear he was losing some of his memory. He had sticky notes all over his house that were found after he died. Some were of things like news conversations and current events, and some were of conversations he had. Ty Hansen had confronted his father on multiple occasions and basically told him, I know you killed Mom, I know she didn't abandon us, and I'm never going to stop looking until I find her bones. In fact, that last sentence, Bob had scribbled on a yellow Post-it note and stuck it to his desk in his home. It was found when his home was being cleaned out for an estate sale. Bob made one last attempt to become a Costa Rican citizen. He felt the walls closing in on him with his son's quest to find answers for his mother. This citizenship was denied, and in 2009, Bob Hansen died by suicide. Bob's surviving children struggled with what feelings to feel after his death. In a sense, they didn't really grieve their father. It was complicated to reconcile some of the good memories they had with him, but the stark contrast to his evil was so prevalent. But they did feel some hopelessness that they would just never now find Joanne's body, and that Bob took the secrets he had to his grave. Ty Hansen had already spent thousands of dollars out of pocket on the search for his mom, with ground-penetrating radar on old properties and pursuing new investigative leads. Bob left his entire fortune to friends he made in Costa Rica, and explicitly stated that should his ex-wife ever show up, she were to get none of his money. Same for his surviving children. So Ty did an unconventional move. He sued his deceased father's estate for him and his siblings on behalf of his mother. He sued his father for damages and hoped that securing any of the money would assist him in finding his mother. If nothing else, it would finally bring some legal culpability, and he felt send a message to his deceased mother that they didn't give up. In the end, they received only about $90,000 of the estate, which was worth over $5 million, and it was split 3 ways, between Ty, his sibling, and the lawyer. To this day, Joanne's body has never been found, and so while her case is arguably solved in the sense of who did this to her, her family can never really feel at peace knowing that Joanne's body is still out there somewhere. Sure, Bob led a complicated and not a life I would envy, but he got to continue his life while she didn't. Joanne loved being a mother, and she never got to raise her children or watch them grow up beyond the age of 4 years old. They missed out on having a beautiful, loving mother figure in their life. Instead, they were subjected to the temper and wrath of Bob Hansen. Joanne's family desperately still wants to find her body so that they can give her a proper burial and have a place to visit her. I want to just take a moment to share some information from Safe Horizon on intimate partner violence. The term intimate partner violence includes the following acts as inflicted or caused by a current or former intimate partner: actual threats of physical violence, actual threats of sexual violence, emotional or psychological abuse, for example, name-calling or put-downs, threats to out a person's sexual orientation to family, work, or friends, stalking, for example, excessive calls, texts, emails, monitoring daily activities, and using technology to track a person's location, financial abuse, such as withholding money, ruining credit, stopping a partner from getting or keeping a job, and intimate partners can include current or former spouses, boyfriends or girlfriends, dating partners, or sexual partners. The statistics are astounding. 1 in 4 women and 1 in 7 men will experience severe physical violence by an intimate partner in their lifetime. 1 in 10 women in the United States will be raped by an intimate partner in her lifetime. An estimated 9.7% of women and 2.3% of men have been stalked by an intimate partner during their lifetime. Nearly half of all women and men in the United States will experience psychological aggression by an intimate partner in their lifetime. Over half of female and male victims of rape, physical violence, and/or stalking by intimate partner experienced some form of intimate partner violence for the first time before the age of 25 years old. Almost half, 47.5%, of American Indian/Alaska Native women, 45.1% of non-Hispanic Black women, and 37.3% of non-Hispanic white women, and 34.4% of Hispanic women, and 18.3% of Asian Pacific Islander women experience contact, sexual violence, physical violence, and/or stalking by an intimate partner in their lifetime. If you or someone you know is experiencing intimate partner violence, there's help. The National Domestic Violence Hotline is available in English, Spanish, and over 200 plus through interpretation services 24/7, 365. You just need to contact 800-799-7233 or text 88788. This has been a Simpler Time True Crime. If you appreciate the work I'm doing, please leave a review on any of the podcast platforms and share this podcast with your friends. I cover cases from the early 2000s and before, and my goal is to get these cases out there to as many people as possible. You can follow me on Instagram @SimplerTimeCrimePod. Thank you so much for listening.